Greetings and welcome to Mr. Campbell's Global 10 class. We're in Unit 4, the Cold War, Section 2, Communist Revolution in Mao's China. And that's really what this set of notes will explore is how China's government kind of exits this dynastic cycle and a period of brief kind of nationalistic rule and civil war, and then the rise of the Chinese Communist Party in its evolution into eventually what China will become today. Self-test questions. How did the communists come to power in China in 1949? What were the goals and the effects of the Great Leap Forward? What were the causes and impacts of the Great Cultural Revolution? And what are two policies of Mao Zedong and their effects on China? Heads up, they're going to be the Great Leap Forward and the Great Cultural Revolution. So we haven't talked about China really, except through like the lens of the Japanese invasions in World War II and kind of circumstantial discussions. So when we last left off in China, China had been divided into different spheres of influence by the European powers and later on the Japanese during this age of new imperialism, right? And then we had said that Japan had invaded China in 1937 as part of World War II and imperialism, leading to one of the more horrifying atrocities, up there with the Holocaust, the rape of Nanjing, the systematic murder of a massive civilian population in Nanjing, China. And then China, we know, undergoes a communist revolution in 1949 because that was mentioned in the beginning of our Cold War notes. So we have to fill in the gaps in between these. We need to talk about the Chinese Republic under Sun Yat-sen. We need to talk about the warlord period, the Second Republic, and the Chinese Civil War of the communists versus the nationalists or Kuomintang. So that's what we're going to dig into. So the Revolution of 1911. Now, as the Qing dynasty is kind of petering out and, taken apart by piece by the European powers, they effectively don't control large portions of their coast and interior as the concepts of extraterritoriality and European colonial rule are kind of starting to filter in. You saw various nationalist groups, various visionaries and reformers try to come up with ways that they thought they could make China strong again and possibly release China from this kind of chokehold of European dominance. And one of these parties was the Kuomintang, or roughly Chinese Nationalist Party. And their leader in this time period is a medical doctor and political visionary named Sun Yat-sen. You're going to see in parentheses these other spellings because if the Regents uses an older document, pre-1980s generally, you're going to see this other spelling. This is considered to be the more accurate one, Sun Yat-sen, Kuomintang, but Kuomintang, Sun Yat-sen, older spellings. So he forms this nationalist party upon this concept of the three policies of the people, or the three principles of the people. Nationalism, that China should be ruled by Chinese people, right? Self-determination, self-rule. Democracy, that we should lead China into a democratic republic where leaders are elected, not too dissimilar from a European style of government. And livelihood, that it is the job and duty and the mandate, if you will, of this Chinese government to promote the social welfare through jobs and basically through making sure everyone's needs are met. And what you see in 1911, as the old emperor dies and we transition to a new emperor, Pinyin, who's only like 5-6 years old when he takes power, quote unquote, is a revolution explodes across China. So this is the Chinese army and the commoners revolting against the Qing dynasty, resenting both the inadequate rule, the ineffective rule of the Qing, as well as the fact that the Qing are regarded as foreigners, that they aren't considered ethnic Chinese. And military units rally behind this revolution and join it. And so effectively the military now can't stop it because they have joined the revolution. And so they create and become part of this provisional government known as the ROC, or the Republic of China. And Sun Yat-sen, who had actually been in exile for much of his life living outside of China, returns and becomes president of this Republic of China. And for this reason, he's remembered as the father of the nation. And it's kind of interesting because, as we get into it, the communists are going to be one party, the nationalists are going to be another, and the nationalists and their descendants are still alive today. They live in Taiwan. And even though these groups really dislike each other pretty intensely, both groups acknowledge Sun Yat-sen for his influence on this revolution and his vision of a better China as the father of the nation. He has, a very beautiful tomb, even though he is a member of the Nationalist Party that the communists fight. They still regard him as kind of the inspiration behind their liberation from dynastic control. Unfortunately for Sun Yat sen, while he is a brilliant political theorist, a medical doctor, a man of letters, he is not a military commander. So, in order to try to keep the military allied with this provisional government and not have China explode in more micro revolutions or sectarian or successionist movements, he has to cut a deal with the military. So, what this deal looks like is Sun Yat sen steps down as president and appoints a very powerful general who effectively had control over most of the military. He would be listened to, and his name was Yuan Shikai, pictured here. And the goal here and the idea behind this is Sun Yat-sen steps down because he believes Yuan Shikai will keep the loyalty of the military towards this republic, and it will give Sun Yat-sen and other nationalists, other members of the Kuomintang, time to create a constitution and the democratic principles they want. Unfortunately for them, Yuan Shikai has no desire to implement democracy in China, and he begins acting more and more like an emperor, formulating decrees and rules that effectively will usher in a new dynasty, his dynasty. But before those can happen, he dies of natural causes in 1916. Unfortunately, now with this kind of overarching control of the military gone, what you see is the warlord period. As different generals and military leaders, so it's mostly military commanders, they begin to set themselves up as like warlords or kings, if you will, carving out their military governorships, their provinces, into mini feudal kingdoms. Only now, it's feudalism with guns and rifles and artillery and stuff. And this is known as the warlords era or warlordism. And all these warlords, these generals, are going to fight over resources, over control over coastal cities and major towns, and just whatever. They're just going to fight for power. So the warlords era is a very brutal time period in China. This, nearly a decade, 2 decades of famine, constant warfare, death, lawlessness. Each of these warlord areas had their own brand of law. You had a lot of banditry or brigandry, where people, disassociate military units that didn't necessarily have loyalty to a military commander. Just 5 dudes in the woods with a couple rifles, just robbing people. Political instability, economic stagnation. Obviously, this fragmentation is not good for your economy. And in this weakness, the Japanese are going to expand their power. This is when they're carving a larger and larger sphere of influence out. So, the weakness of China is the advantage of Japan. So, in 1925, the Kuomintang Party basically has a new leader, a guy named Chiang Kai-shek, or like I said, older writing, Chiang Jaeshi. And he is a military leader. He has military units under his control, and he joins forces with another powerful political party, the Communist Party of China. And he's like, the nationalists aren't strong enough to crush these warlords by ourselves. The communists aren't strong enough to crush the warlords by yourselves. But together, we can defeat these warlords, unify China in this military alliance, and then we'll hold an election and we'll see where the people want to go with us. Do they want, we'll have a democracy, communist party, and a nationalist party. And it's this alliance is successful. They are able to wipe out most of the warlords to rejoin these errant parts of China into this military alliance, and they are able to kind of push back a little bit, a tiny bit, against Western powers as China seems to be growing stronger and stronger. And after China's unified, Chiang Kai-shek really shows his true colors, and he launches what's called the White Terror, this 3-year period of trying to eliminate all communists. This is an anti-communist purge. All right, he had no intentions of sharing power are holding truly open elections with communists, he wants to wipe them out. And it is pretty successful, brutally. I mean, the communists did not see this coming. They had fought, in some cases, side by side with these nationalist army units. They saw them as brothers in arms, different political and economic viewpoints, but all wanting a stronger China. And they bled besides these people. And then all of a sudden, there's just a widespread purge of the Communist Party. And this is a very famous photo of these. They're just executing captured so-called communists in the street, and they kill thousands of them. I mean, it's almost successful. And then in 1934, seeing that there's still some communists alive, let's kill all of them. Chiang Kai-shek rallies the nationalist army and sends them southward into the home base of communist political control and activity. And the goal here is to finish the job, to truly execute and wipe out all remnants of communism in China. They are marching through the countryside here. They are meeting with peasants. They are meeting with commoners, and they gain their support. Like, even though they're being hunted, if it was like harvest or planting season, the Communist Army would like stop and help the peasants with stuff. Mao Zedong ordered that the Red Army, the Communist Army, even though they were starving, they must not steal or take anything from the farmers. Even though, they had guns and the farmers didn't. They're like, no, 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 we can't take anything from these people. We must treat them with kindness. If we need food, we will work for it. And they also, talk to them about Chinese communism. They're like, yeah, we're the communists and we're fighting, last ditch effort here. But if we win, if we take down the nationalists, your lives are tough because of rich people, because of landlords. And the Chinese peasants are like, yeah, no, the landlords, their rent is too high. Their taxes are too high. They treat us badly. And Mao Zedong's like, yeah, so if we win, we're going to end all that. Like, everyone's going to get land. It's going to be totally great. This guy Marx wrote some ideas down. I like them. I'll share them with you. Here's a pamphlet. And so they win the support of the peasants to this march. Again, the survivors, the communists, are super dedicated to Mao. And also, they really hate the nationalists. They really hate Chiang Kai-shek because he, betrayed them multiple times. And eventually, a long-term effect of the Long March is it becomes this element of propaganda to show the determination and power of the Communist Party. And it also did make the nationalists look bad because as they're marching behind the communists, the nationalists were not good to the peasants. They would steal. They would, take advantage of farmers' daughters. It was really, really brutal. They were not country boys. They were city boys, and they really didn't care about these peasants. And if they had given the communists food, even if the communists had worked or paid for it, they're like, well, that's allying the enemy. And so you have this kind of strict dichotomy here. Like, oh, the communists were really nice. They were like pretty all right. And then the nationalist army comes a week later following the communists, and they're awful. They're like, well, these people are terrible. I don't want these people in power. You got this great quote. If you find it hard, think of the Long March. If you feel tired, think of our revolutionary forebears. The message has been drilled into us so that we can accomplish any goal set before us by the party, because nothing compares in difficulty with what they did. Decades after the historical one, we Chinese have been spurred on to ever more long marches, to industrialize China, to feed the largest population in the world, to catch up with the West, to reform the socialist economy, to send men into space, to engage with the 21st century. And so this is a modern Chinese person kind of looking back at the way the Long March has been used as a form of propaganda, that if those old men and women of the Communist Party could survive the Long March, then nothing is impossible. And each new challenge set before China is the new Long March. And every generation must shoulder this Long March into the future of a successful China. So in the midst of this craziness, war, civil war, violence, World War II breaks out. The Japanese invade China in 1937, beginning the War of the Pacific, and that is the beginning of World War II in Asia specifically. And you have that Japanese brutality, you have the rape of Nanjing, the massacres, just that awfulness that we talked about when we talked about wartime atrocities, sacking these major Chinese cities. And During this invasion, both the nationalists, the Kuomintang, and Mao's communists fought against the Japanese, but the communists were wildly more successful. And the nationalists gained a really bad reputation for corruption. Like, yeah, we'll protect this city, we'll defend it if you guys give us all your gold, jewelry, and whatever else you have. They fled. You might actually remember the rape of Nanjing happened in part because the nationalist army fled Nanjing. They chose not to truly protect the city, and they're like, I don't think we can beat the Japanese. We're out of here, and they left. Hiding, only supporting cities and urban people. They didn't generally support the country people. And then when they were fleeing, they would steal from the peasants. So you have the communists out there like every village is important, every Chinese life is important. And the nationalists were like, yeah, only cities are important, and I need your food. I'm going to take it. That's a pretty cool pitchfork. I don't even need a pitchfork, but I want one, so I'm taking that too. And so this also wins Mao's communists a lot of support from the peasants and the workers. Throughout this brutal period of Japanese occupation, the communists are seen as the defenders of the people. The nationalists are seen as like some sort of parasite, feeding off the people and then cowardly running away at the first sign of Japanese aggression. And so eventually Japan is defeated. The Chinese fight against them, of course, but the big haymaker was, of course, the dropping of the nuclear weapons. And almost immediately, a civil war breaks out, right? The communists aren't going to be fooled again. They're like, all right, the Japanese are the bigger enemy, but like we're not going to like, oh, well, we beat the Japanese together. Yay, high five. No, immediately a brutal civil war breaks out. Chinese nationalist and communist armies fighting undeclared civil war. Government suffers 15,000 casualties. A newspaper clipping from that time period. Who is fighting this? This is Mao's communists versus Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists. And I think you can see the writing on the wall. The communists have emerged from their suffering a hardened, well-disciplined, well-drilled military unit. They are more successful against the Japanese, and they have the support of the people. So, like, shockingly, the communists win. It does take a couple years. You know, the Civil War is 1945 to 1949, but Mao's communists effectively drive the Kuomintang out of China. And, you know, I say shockingly, but it honestly did shock some people in the world. Most notoriously, it shocked America. We supported Chiang Kai-shek. We sold them slash gave them military technology, military weapons. And so when these communists won, America was pretty upset about this. So why do the communists win? One, they had the support of the peasants. They were just better liked. Their goals seemed more in line with peasant goals of like getting land and not having landlords like squeeze them. They promised land reform. They promised giving land to the common people. They used guerrilla warfare. The nationalists were trained to fight like a standard army of the time, you know, stand up, pitched battles. And the guerrilla warfare, hiding in the mountains, hit and run tactics, they can pick apart more standardized armies, or at least make them suffer very high casualties. And they also had increased support from women because they promised a more egalitarian society. And so the nationalists, Chiang Kai-shek, they flee to Taiwan, which is an island, if you don't know, in Asia, in the Pacific Ocean. And Chiang Kai-shek, his nationalists, the government, whatever soldiers were allied to him, they flee and they set up this rebel province known as the Republic of China. Now, today, they don't necessarily still call themselves that. They call themselves Taiwan. But the Taiwanese government is still this leftover of these Kuomintang, these Chinese nationalists. And today, China views Taiwan as a rebel province. So one of the things that leads to U.S.-Chinese tensions today is that we have supported Taiwan, this Republic of China, because you know it was the party we supported during the Civil War, and we wanted them as a counterbalance to growing Chinese power. So historically, we've sold them weapons, and I don't mean just like rifles, machine guns. We sell them like advanced fighter jets and stuff like that, and that support angers communist China today. The People's Republic of China, their government today, has historically not like this. They've seen it as us like arming a rebel army against them. And today, because I think we just secured another arms deal selling more stuff about a year ago, another arms deal, $1.3 billion or something like that. They view it as us again arming someone who is avowedly against them. So that does lead to strained relationships between China and the United States today. So in 1949, they win the Civil War, and Mao Zedong declares the creation of the People's Republic of China. And this is the government of China today, the PRC, a dictatorship of the proletariat. So what he's describing this is the people, right, the proletariat of the laborers and workers, will dictate the future of our country. That's not what's going to happen. Mao Zedong is going to be the dictator. And we're going to see this time and time and time and time again. Lenin does this, Stalin does this, Fidel Castro does this. Pretty much this happens in every communist government and society that's ever won their civil war. So now we have two Chinas. ROC, Republic of China, ruled by Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. They are today democratic, supported by the US, and they are kept in the United Nations at least until the 1980s. The other side of this, People's Republic of China, ruled by Mao and the Communist Party of China. Mainland China, this is red China, hence the red flag, and that is still the flag of Communist China today. They are essentially ignored by the United States. We're like, nope, this is the real China, even though they're only a tiny little island. You guys are fake China because we don't like you. And the United Nations didn't recognize them until the 1970s when America started to follow a policy of detent. So what reforms does Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, oversee as they first take power? Well, I would argue they had some initial great ideas and some initial successes, even if the reasons behind them weren't always super, super great. So one thing the Chinese Communist Party does, and we saw this happen in Russia as well when the communists took over there, is they expand primary and middle school education and eventually high school education as well. So in 1950, right when they take over, about 15% of Chinese people finished essentially an elementary school education and made it into some form of middle school. By 1970, 20 years later, that is 66%. Two-thirds of Chinese were making it through basic reading and writing. And that is huge because that is millions upon millions of people. Very quickly, entire generations are educated. Now, the reason for this might be then this educated population is more able to consume communist propaganda. That is one of the reasons they did that in Russia. Is like, okay, well, if we have strict censorship and we're only going to allow Pravda in China and Chinese communist newspapers and writing materials and reading materials in China, then we want people to be able to read so they can read our propaganda. But I think there was also some positive motivation behind this too, of just trying to uplift China and make the lives and the potentiality of its people better. One thing Mao did that's definitely good, he expanded women's rights. Women's rights in China were essentially non-existent, right? Under the Qing dynasty, they're still following this old Confucian idea that women are, in terms of a family status, in terms of even social status, very, very, very low. And so Mao says, no, they're comrades. Right? They're kind of our equals here. And so in 1950, so right after taking power, he passed the marriage law. Women, for the first time in China, are given true legal equality. They are recognized as legal equals to men. Women are allowed to own property, which they generally hadn't been. And women were allowed to divorce. That did lead to a little bit of a kind of a chaotic period where tons of women divorced their husbands, and the communists like, whoa, we were not expecting quite that. But eventually does kind of stabilize. And he outlawed practices that he viewed as poor treatment of women. Arranged marriages, outlawed. Concubines, second wives, third wives. If you're rich enough, you had these younger wives. And infanticide, no more killing of female girls, and foot binding, a practice to make women, appear more attractive. This breaking of these children's feet to form them these tiny little 3-inch long feet. That's all outlawed. So this is good. And then, certainly Mao wants the support of the women, but like this is all just Good. Let's make women more equal. And he does redistribute land to peasants. Land is taken away from landlords and given to the peasant class. And so, in this initial period of communist rule, nearly 300 million peasants, because again, most of the population of China were agricultural peasants, are given land for the first time. For the first time in their possibly their history of their entire family dating back millennia, they are landowners in control of their own economic future and destiny. Downside of that, that land had been owned by people called landlords. And those landlords, many of them were killed in the process. Either they refused to give up this land, or just honestly, like, the peasants just beat the crap out of them until they killed them because they're like, you could have given us this land at any time. So, yeah, the rise of one class, the lowering of another. We're going to see the landlords and even the descendants of landlords have a really rough life under Chinese communism because, well, the very idea of landlordism is capitalism, right? You have private property and you invest in that private property, whether it's land, whether it's a house that you rent, whatever, it's capital, and then you make a profit from that. Landlordism is a form of capitalism. And so it is anathema, it is oppositional to communism. So Mao also seeks to build up the military. Now, not all of these are done under Mao. Specifically, this one is not Mao, but the rest of these are. So Mao wants the People's Republic of China to be a world power. Most noticeably, he's afraid of a American invasion. He's afraid that like America is going to arm the Republic of China, Taiwan, and like try to overthrow the communist rule. So he develops and expands the military. It's the largest army in the world today, 1.6 million active soldiers. And he trains them to be basically more effective. Instead of just like, I don't know, point the gun at stuff, shoot it, he's going to implement, and his military commanders will implement widespread, relatively effective training. And we see the success of this because in 1953 in Korea, the Chinese invade into Korea to push back United Nations soldiers, and they're able to push them into a stalemate. Despite the better technology of the US and the United Nations forces, the People's Republic of China is able to fight them to a standstill. Was it at tremendous human cost? Did they lose more men, pound for pound, in fighting UN soldiers? Yes, they did. They're still kind of rocking out some human wave attacks, just hoping to overwhelm the UN with numbers, but it was effective, kind of. They also fought India over borderland in 1962. They still disagree about that today. And they invaded communist Vietnam in 1979 and kind of fought those two powers to a standstill as well. In 1964, China tested its first nuclear bomb. They are a nuclear power of the world today. They do have nuclear weapons. And they created a hydrogen bomb, a more powerful form of bomb, in 1967. This emphasis on building up and maintaining the power of the People's Republic of China and their military has continued into this day. One of the most noticeable modern day exhibitions of this is the buying and then the building of aircraft carriers. Now, we've mentioned aircraft carriers before. They are a major technology. They are really one of the more powerful military things in the world today, and they're incredibly, incredibly, incredibly expensive. And to build a good one, it's incredibly high levels of technology that are necessitated. So here's the deal. China bought one of these old, leaky, couldn't actually move on its own power, had to be tugged to China, an aircraft carrier, nuclear powered aircraft carrier from the Soviet Union. And the whole world was like, well, that's probably not good. And China's like, no, we're totally gonna like use it for practicing like landing on smaller airfields. And in reality, China was basically rebuilding it. They were reverse engineering this nuclear powered aircraft carrier and learning how to build one for themselves. They then renovated the aircraft carrier and launched it as the Yong, and they are now building at least two more super aircraft carriers. So you might have to remember, one of the things that makes America so powerful is we have more super aircraft carriers than the entire world combined. We have 10 of them right now. I know we're going to decommission two, and we are building three more, but I think we're going to decommission another one. Essentially, we try to keep 10 going. And again, that's more than the rest of the world has combined. The fact that China's cranking out three of these pretty shortly, and they might secretly be building more, or shortly after not secretly build a couple more, that is a serious challenge to United States global supremacy. Whether you think United States global supremacy is a good thing, a bad thing, whatever, certainly them having kind of the same military capabilities at us, but much larger population, that's probably not great if you believe in kind of United States global power. So all this stuff is going on. We're redistributing land. We're freeing women from the bondage of the patriarchy of Confucianism. Doing lots of good stuff. Good stuff's going down. And so in 1956, Mao Zedong and the Communist Party encourage criticism. They're like, all right, we've been in power for like, 6, 7 years. How are we doing? They want a little checkup, a little report card from the Chinese people. And this was known as the 100 Flowers of Thought campaign, or sometimes just called the 100 Flowers campaign. By the way, get used to this whole campaign word. That this is like the go-to word of communist governments, and especially in China. They still do this to this day. It's basically like everything's treated like a campaign of war. Like we are undertaking a struggle, a battle. This is the newest one. So just get used to that word. It's very commonly associated with communism. The de-kulakization, the anti-Stalinization, all these different campaigns. So Mao Zedong and the Communist Party expected nothing but praise, right? They've given land, they've done this, they've done that, they've freed women, and it's honestly disastrous. While, yes, some people do write positive stuff, I mean, generally ask people how things are going. They are rarely going to say what's going well. Like, they're like, hey, how's this year going? No one's going to be like, well, I'm home more or something like that. Everyone is going to be pretty upset and going to start criticizing everything that's going on. And that's exactly what happens. People criticized Mao's rule. They criticized the Communist Party. They criticized communist leaders. They're like, this guy's kind of corrupt. This guy's not redistributing land fast enough. Why does this landlord still have so much land? Who does he know? It would be nice if food prices were cheaper. Everything gets criticized. And so Mao's like, well, this isn't good. And so cause and effect, because people criticized, he launches a brutal anti-rightist campaign. Now, the Chinese Communist Party has all these different weird words to describe people that they don't like, essentially. People that criticize the government. We might call them, let's see how my writing skills are, dissidents. People who don't agree with the government. Dissidents, dissidents. And so this is the anti-rightist campaign. Rightists in this communist viewpoint were people who wanted to return to a non-communist government. In reality, they were just anyone that criticized communism. So this is a purge. Yeah, it's purge time. It's been a couple years. It's time to go to Purge Town. And they're purging specifically intellectuals, because these are the ones that were the best writers and had the great, kind of the arguably the better ideas for proper criticism. And so this was intellectuals, people with college educations, Western education. If you had spent any time out of China and had received like a university degree from Oxford or the University of Paris or anything like that, and anyone who had criticized communism. And so during this purge, about 300,000 people are imprisoned or sent to labor camps. Yep, China's got labor camps too. Here's one of them. You got the Chinese communist officers riding on bicycles screaming at these people as they're marched to dig a pit or dig a well or dig a canal or dig whatever. And what this does is make it very much so that people are reluctant to criticize Mao or the Chinese government. This is going to be kind of the first sign that, like, yeah, you know what? Next time they ask us for how we think about the Communist Party, let's just say they're doing great. Like, thumbs up, 2 thumbs up. We love it. It's awesome. And so I guess technically the anti-rightist campaign is successful, but definitely it is not living up to the dreams of this 100 Flower campaigns. You've got this great, tons of great art from this time period, just interesting art. And so you have the original 100 Flowers campaign. The policy of letting 100 flowers bloom and 100 schools of thought contend is designed to promote the flourishing of arts and the progress of science. And he had these posters. Please tell us what you think. Write these big character posters describing how we can improve. And then when people did, he's like, all right, now instead you're going to go die in a labor camp somewhere. So not super, super great. So Mao Zedong is like, all right, so I've made some changes. People criticized him, crushed those people. What am I going to do next? What's my big plan? Where's my end goal here? And Mao, much like Joseph Stalin, wanted to make the People's Republic of China a world industrial power. And just like Stalin launches his 5 year plans, the Chinese are going to launch 5 year plans. And this is known as the Great Leap Forward. Please star the heck out of this. This is mas importante. All right. So the Great Leap Forward is another campaign, shockingly enough. The goal, increase factory output and production, especially of steel and other industrial goods, and increase agricultural output. Sound familiar? Yeah, it's basically Stalin's plan that he proposed to increase and make Soviet Russia a world industrial power. How? Communes. Oh, you mean agricultural collectives like Stalin? Yes. Yes, I do, Billy. Excellent question. A quota system that they're going to take the food that is produced, like Stalin. Yes, great job. Steel production. Yes, indeed. Though we're going to see that the Chinese communists don't do this quite as well. Public works projects, that was kind of similar, but a little bit different. And they are going to sell Chinese grain for Soviet machines. This is kind of a big one. They are going to try to produce as much grain as possible and sell it to the Soviet Union, which, believe it or not, is actually during this period having a hard time feeding all of their population because of collectivization. Remember, the people didn't like collectivization and agricultural production went down or at least stayed stagnant. So the Soviets need grain, the Chinese will produce it, and in exchange, the Soviets will give them tractors, will give them factories, will give them other industrial machinery to be able to industrialize and modernize. Lots of propaganda here. You know, you've got a communications tower in the back. The steel I produce shall make China strong and technologically advanced. You have Mao Zedong and all the people supporting him. You have the production of grain is so high, it is erupting from the fields. All this like ridiculous propaganda. So let's look at the actions, the policy of this Great Leap Forward. One, they create what are called people's communes, which are operated on a quota system. This is the same thing as a collective. It is a government-owned farm. All land, all factories owned and controlled by the government. And what they did is broke down like the villages and they instead created these communes. All the land that they had redistributed, the government took back, just like in the Soviet Union. And they say, okay, to better organize you, you are going to be organized into work brigades, like military units, only your enemy is the soil. Your enemy is, hunger. And so you're going to work and be drilled like a military unit to do labor. And they set up these commune like dormitories too. Like they're like, all right, the idea of eating in the privacy of your own kitchen, that is antithetical to the concepts of communism. We are all going to eat in a commune or communal cafeteria with mass-produced food. That's more efficient. So families were forced by military control to live and work together, generally up to 300 or even 4,000, 5,000 people organizing as these work brigades, working on government-owned farms. Just like we saw in the Soviet Union, the ownership of private property and private ownership of land or even shovels was outlawed. And there's not a ton of criticism of this because they remember what happened during the 100 Flowers campaign. And so they're like, yep, I guess we have to go along with this or we'll be sent away to these labor camps. All of these communes were given quotas or set amounts of food they had to produce. And they put communist, what are called cadre leaders, cadre leaders, spelt the same, in charge of these. And the cadre leaders were often like, They didn't know the countryside. They weren't farmers oftentimes themselves. They were like communists. They had oftentimes been the survivors of the Long March or the children of people who had survived the Long March. And they exaggerate these food quotas to make them seem like they're doing a good job. They're like, oh, how much do you want? You want 5 tons of grain? Listen, bud, I don't know if you know me, but I'm kind of a go getter. We're going to produce 7 tons of grain with my work brigade. And so these quotas are artificially too high. The reports that these cadre leaders are sending in are way over exaggerated. And that is going to mean too much food is taken from the peasants. When the government comes to collect these quotas, they collected whatever the cadre leaders said, whatever that quota was. And that meant there was literally nothing left over for the Chinese peasants who were actually doing all of this labor. I mean, these are some skinny, skinny people. And this is actually in the beginning when there was some food around. So a major effect is a famine. And I would like to point out that this famine is not necessarily caused by drought or anything of that nature. This is a man-made famine. Was Mao trying to do this? No, it's not like the Ukrainian famine, but it just shows that terrible government, in some cases, a communist-style government just doesn't work. This command economy where you're planning everything, it is not responsive to changes. It is not an efficient distribution of resources. And you might say, well, why are the communists taking all the food? Where is it going? Again, don't forget, Mao is selling this grain to the Soviet Union, and he doesn't want to look bad in front of Russia. He doesn't want to look like he can't get his communist system going. So he's going to meet those quotas of sold grain. And that is one of the reasons these grain requisitions, these forced requisitions of grains, continue even as conditions are deplorable in China. Another focus of the Great Leap Forward was steel production. We've mentioned before that really a measure of a nation's industrial and economic power back then was how many tons of steel and iron you produced. Industrial production measured in tons of steel produced yearly. Now, the Soviet Union had built like smelters and factories and steel plants, the right way to make steel. Mao Zedong and the communists didn't really have the expertise to do that. They didn't have the engineers, the architects, the chemists that knew how to make proper steel. Mao Zedong just believed that, if peasants are properly motivated, he believed in this concept known as peasant. If the people are motivated, they can accomplish anything. So Mao, as part of this Great Leap Forward, orders the creation of backyard furnaces or smelters. Basically, just make these generally out of clay. And every commune, these mass government organized family unit work brigades, is going to have to build a lot of these, which again is time they're not spent farming. And they are going to have to be able to create steel. They're going to have quotas of steel to produce. And you can't have peasants that have no education or any expertise in making steel create high quality steel. It's just not going to happen. And you can see here, like they literally just, all right, the women are going to sit around and they're going to break rocks with little hammers. And if the rock is red, it has iron ore in it. And we're going to drop that in the furnace and hope that we can make that burn real hot. And then, yay, steel. And that doesn't make steel. I don't know what to tell you. It makes pig iron or iron ingots, or maybe it makes garbage sometimes. It makes nothing. So the result of this is disastrous. They produced very poor quality pig iron, which is essentially unusable or has to go through so many refining processes to make it usable. It's financially effectively unusable. To meet these quotas, the cadre leaders sometimes told the farmers to melt their farming tools. They're like, all right, we've got to make our steel quota. That's the thing that's most important to Mao. Don't want to let Mao down. Throw your shovels in. Don't worry about it. We're going to make so much good steel, you'll get a new, better shovel later. And so they destroyed useful farming equipment to make unusable nothing. And a big reason this is a disaster is the cadres pressured a lot of people to work on these backyard furnaces. And these peasants working on steel are not focusing on farming. And some of the land goes unfarmed, or it's not farmed as effectively and efficiently as it could have been because people are spending days, weeks, months of their lives trying to melt down ignots into nothingness. And so the loss of these tools and the loss of this labor will contribute again to a famine. Seeing it? Public works projects. As part of the Great Leap Forward, Mao Zedong envisioned all these public works or infrastructure projects that were going to increase industry and increase agricultural productivity. Large, massive public works projects, irrigation systems, bridge and road building, dredging out canals so the water flows properly, draining swamps to create more farmland, clearing land of forests, and building dams to provide hydroelectricity and to control the water. And, arguably, these are all great ideas. Like this, if done right, this could have really helped China. Yeah, this will help farming to have irrigation systems and to control floodwaters and all of that stuff. But ultimately, it's a disaster as well, especially for the peasants, which again are 90 something percent of the Chinese people. So why? Why is this such a disaster when it could have been a good thing? Well, they did clear more land and they did build more irrigation systems. So that long term might be good. But most of these projects, like the backyard furnaces, are poorly planned or poorly executed or poorly designed. This goes back to the same thing with the backyard smelters, that they didn't have architects, they didn't have hydroelectric engineers, they didn't have engineers designing this, they didn't have really skilled farmers. I mean, the Chinese peasants might have been skilled farmers in their own right, but they didn't have people with degrees in agriculture who could plan the best way to do these. A lot of times the planning was done by the local communist cadre leader, who again may or very well may not have any idea what they're really doing. They just know, well, I got to build a road or I got to build a canal. And they're like, all right, well, do we line it? Do we do poured concrete? What do we got here? What's the idea? What's the depth? And they just didn't have any of these answers. So the cadre leaders just forced peasants to work on these projects. They're like, yep, we got to do it. Mao wants a canal here. Mao wants to dredge this older canal. A lot of this work was done by hand. They didn't have tractors and a lot of machinery in China. And again, just Mao didn't believe he needed it. He believed that the peasants properly motivated could do anything. And so what you have is thousands of peasants die from being overworked and exhausted. This woman, yes, is literally like dredging a canal by hand and foot. I mean, it's just exhausting work. And we know there's a famine going on. So being overworked with malnutrition equals humans dying. And again, these peasants who before the Great Leap Forward would have been, most of them, farming, are not farming, which means not enough food is going to be produced. And again, just hand dug canals, just really tough, brutal work, awful conditions. So the propaganda of this time period was great. That the Great Leap Forward was killing it, and there is tons of this Chinese propaganda. The one thing that was turning out a lot of productivity is the Chinese propaganda machinery, making all of these posters, fake news reports of how much food was being produced. Oh, we're producing so much food. So basically, everyone thought the Great Leap Forward must be working. Like, it's got to be working. Like the poster says, we're making steel. The poster says, look at the bountiest harvest under communist rule. Look at the size of these vegetables. That this was the vision that we were producing. Here, here's Mao's vision of what one of these commune work brigades would look like. You have a dam controlling the water. You have well-organized farm fields with the workers happily singing a song as they harvest. You have proper canal systems, new bridges and roads dug, backyard smelters producing iron. You have so much wheat that this guy can't even see what's going on here. You have silos full of food, and you have a defense group protecting people, and all the time the trucks are bringing the food to the cities in a successful relationship of countryside and city. And the same thing here, all these terraced fields, this beautiful commune, these dormitories where people lived and ate together as happy families. And the reality was very, very different. And again, just more propaganda. God, that's a great one. We should return the government's benevolence and enthusiastic production and support for the front line. We are grateful to the Communist Party and to Chairman Mao. Li Fengjin and Guo Shijin were free, happy, and hardworking. That this is the effects of the communists being in charge. That they have these parades with all these baskets full of wheat. And then this is like a really famous photo from this time period. In order to use propaganda to show how much food was being produced, this was published in 1959, 1 year after the beginning of the Great Leap Forward, and it was widely distributed in China. This became a very popular photo that the Communist Party mass produced and sent everywhere and put in newspapers. And the idea here is it was supposed to show a field so thick with wheat, that was so productive that these children, these teenagers, are standing on top of the wheat, like standing on top of grass, and they're not even sinking into it. But of course, the reality is it's a staged photo. There was a bench behind the wheat, and there was so little grass in the field that they took this photo in that they actually harvested wheat from a bunch of different fields and transplanted it to the frontier to make it look like there's a good crop. But in reality, there was so little food being produced. So, of course, the reality of this is just famine. Famine, 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 human misery, and nothing productive being done. And these are actual photos, just people dying in the streets and countryside, people starving to death, families just mourning in a constant state of horror, and producing garbage, useless pig iron, working on these just terrible public works projects that were poorly engineered. Some of them didn't even work. And you've got this great cartoon here. This was used on a Regents a couple of years ago, had a very, very high miss rate. So I want to kind of talk about it. The title or the caption was "Every person in Mao's China is entitled to a free government plot of land." That's the idea of Mao's redistribution of land. But the reality was the free plot of land was your burial plot. That's the only land you'll ever get is dying of hunger, and you'll be buried in the earth. So, effects of the Great Leap Forward: 2 to 3 years of low production of food. That's why it doesn't last a full 5 years like it was supposed to. Widespread famine. We think at least 30 million, I've seen as high as 37 million Chinese people die in 3 years. This is, as far as we know in history, in human history, the deadliest famine that has ever occurred. During this time period of low productivity, Mao continued exporting what was harvested to Soviet Russia to maintain face, to seem like they were doing well, and to pay for the machines. Millions more starved. Like, this number could have been a lot lower had Mao just been like, all right, well, we're not exporting any of the grain we are producing because we need it. We need every grain of it to feed people. And instead, no, he kept exporting it. This famine was made worse by drought. Some of these irrigation projects were so poorly designed that they actually led to a lack of water, or they led to increased flooding because of their poor design, flooding the new farm fields they did create, and because of this massive locust swarms brought about by the Great Leap Forward's campaign called Kill the Four Pests. Basically, again, there's all these different campaigns. As part of the Great Leap Forward, Mao Zedong, the Chinese Communist Party, and the cadres, they were like, all right, well, we have to kill all the animals that eat our grain. And so one of these animals was like sparrows and small birds. And so in China, like, they just killed all the sparrows they could find and all these birds they could find. In big cities, they would bang pots and pans and chase whole flocks of birds around, never letting them land because a bird that's startled will fly. And they literally just banged pots and pans until all the birds dropped from the sky with exhaustion. They stamped on them and killed them. Well, the problem is these birds, yes, occasionally they ate grain, but they also ate grubs and larvae of locusts. And so the next year, when there were no birds to eat the locust larvae, these locusts emerged from their pupa in massive, like sky blackening swarms, and they devoured what little grain there was. Um, and we have this great quote from Mao. He's just an awful human being. When there is not enough to eat, people starve to death. It is better to let half of the people die so the other half can eat their fill. And this is like when they're doing the report to the Politburo, or the governing council of Communist China. Like, this is what he says to him. It's just like, well, some people gotta die so other people can eat. And you got this great chart here. You've got this time period of the Great Leap Forward, and just no one's having children. Just like everyone's dying, and it's brutal. It's brutal. This is just so damaging to Chinese population. So another effect here is Mao loses face, and he loses political support and power within the Communist Party. Now, while Mao is in charge of the Communist Party, he doesn't have yet Stalin's like total control. They didn't set up, or he didn't set up, a secret police as efficient and brutal and terrifying as that of the Soviet Union. He didn't have quite the level of control. And so in these Politburo councils, basically no one's really listening to Mao's ideas anymore, because they're like, yeah, the old man led us through the Long March and he led us through the Civil War, but maybe his time is past. Maybe he should retire. And reformers, people who wanted to do things based on, like, science and math and engineering, specifically Deng Xiaoping and Liu Shikai, they take over and they start making the actual day-to-day decisions. So this will lead us to our next of Mao's great political decisions, the Great Cultural Revolution. And star this one for me. This is kind of a big deal. These are the two big deals of Mao, this and the Long March, of course. So Mao is effectively forced to resign by pressure of the other leading communists because of the failure of the Great Leap Forward. And he's still kind of there, and he still goes to meetings occasionally, but he's not in charge anymore. And intellectuals, people with a higher level of education, and people with new ideas of how to modernize China, Lin Shukai, Zhao Enlai, and Deng Xiaoping, who's going to be a huge guy later, so remember him. And these are all survivors of the Long March. Like, I describe them as intellectuals, and they are, because they read, and they had a baseline education, and they believed in science, engineering, mathematics, and all that stuff, where Mao just believed in peasant power. But they also are hardcore soldiers. Like, they are tough as nails dudes, and they want to focus on trying to recover from the Great Leap Forward. They begin to reverse most of the policies, the quota systems, the grain sales, all of these different things that were part of Mao's Great Leap Forward. And Mao, even though he's acknowledged as, like, the savior of the Communist Party, he's consulted less and he's included in fewer and fewer high level government meetings. And Mao really, really, really resents this. Mao, sees himself like, I saved the Communist Party. I led us through our darkest times. I should be the chairman of the people. I should be in charge. And so he engineers what's known as the Great Cultural Revolution. And this is going to be his method. This is going to be his means of returning himself to total control over China and total control over the people of China. So this is the Great Cultural Revolution. Goals of the Great Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1976, so a decade of this policy. He wants to renew communist loyalty. People had doubted the communist way of doing things because it led to, famine and death and mass horror and, cannibalism and awfulness. He believed in what he called a continuous revolution, that after any revolution happens, invariably the leaders of that revolution become too entrenched and comfortable and become part of a new system that in turn must be revolted against. That only in renewing the revolutionary fervor and spirit In a continuous cycle of revolution, breakdown, and revolution again, will China be able to experience true communism? And as part of that, he launches that because it's going to help him remove these intellectuals from power. So it's going to initiate a series of purges. Secretly, the main goal is to return Mao to power through a cult of personality. So again, these are like the outside goals that he publicly announces. We must renew communist loyalty. We must have continuous revolution. And we must remove the intellectuals. Another name he gave for it was the capitalist roaders, the capitalist railroaders. People wanted to bring back capitalism. But secretly, this is really about bringing Mao back to power. What are the actions undertaken? Propaganda, propaganda, and some propaganda. Create and empower this group called the Red Guards. These are teens and children. And because they're more impressionable, build a cult of personality around Mao for the heroism he envisioned during the Long March and the Chinese Civil War, and glorify everything he did. Publicly criticize anyone who does not follow Mao in this new policy of cultural revolution. Purge people and send people to labor camps if you don't kill them outright. And destroy the four olds. Destroy everything old about China. And this is his big speech, the 16 points that kind of are considered the launch of the Cultural Revolution. Although the bourgeoisie has been overthrown, it is still trying to use the old ideas, culture, custom, and habits of the exploiting classes to corrupt the masses, to capture their minds, and to stage a comeback. The proletariat must do just the opposite. It must meet head on every challenge of the bourgeoisie to change the outlook of society. Currently, our objective is to struggle against and crush those people in authority who are taking the capitalist road, to criticize and repudiate the reactionary bourgeoisie academic authorities and the ideology of the bourgeoisie and all other exploiting classes, and to transform education, literature, and art, and all other parts of the superstructure that do not correspond to the socialist economic base, so as to facilitate the consolidation and development of the socialist system. And this is the beginning. You can see them using these words. The capitalist roaders, which became an insult during the Cultural Revolution, to get rid of the authorities, i.e., Zhao Enlai and Deng Xiaoping and Liu Shiquo, all these guys, and to oversee a change in education, literature, and art. So we're going to look at these different actions of the Great Cultural Revolution. One, propaganda. It is used massively to spread Mao's message of eternal revolution. One of the ways they did this is through the use of big character posters. These are massive, like essays, if you will, written in huge letters so they can be easily read. And Mao encouraged these to denounce capitalists, so anyone who had any wealth at all, just like we saw in Stalin when they did the purges. If you have 2 bags of grain and I have 1, then you're a capitalist. And also to denounce the enemies of Mao. So anyone Mao criticized then gets criticized across China in these huge art posters. Here's Mao, saying and kind of cajoling the people to write their ideas down. But again, they're only going to be writing ideas critical of those in power, the intellectuals, the people who are trying to change and make China have enough food. Another one, massive propaganda machine, was the Little Red Book. Mao starts mass production of this book called Quotations from the Chairman Mao, also known as the Little Red Book. And I do want you to start that. You really need to know this. This is a collection, supposedly, of quotes and sayings from Mao Zedong, and all Chinese were expected to carry it with them at all times and be able to quote from it off the top of their head. They made 350 million copies within 1 year, and they were just handed out to everyone. And not carrying this with you was being seen as a sign of being a traitor and an enemy to the glorious leader Mao, and you could be beaten or even killed for not having this on you at all times. And the propaganda, the Little Red Book, all of this suggested very publicly that any authority other than Mao himself was capitalist and bourgeoisie and therefore wrong and would need to be purged from the party. How? Who's going to do this purging? How is he suddenly going to get powerful? Well, the Red Guards. The Red Guards were Chinese students and kids and teenagers who were urged to experience revolution. Mao's argument to the Red Guards to get them excited was like, I struggled through the Long March. The founding members of the Communist Party struggled through the Civil War. We experienced the revolution personally, but now, like we've been in charge for a generation, you, the children, must experience your own revolution. Only guided by Mao will you know the joy and wonder of tearing down the old society and rebuilding something new. And they get called the Red Guards because they wear red armbands to show their loyalty to communism and their loyalty to Mao Zedong. And here you have the red armbands, and you can see it's just teenagers and kids, really. And so what did they do? Well, they attacked anyone in authority, anyone that these big character posters announced the Red Guards attacked. They attacked their teachers, they attacked professors. It's thought that at least nearly 150,000 teachers and professionals were persecuted. Professors and high school teachers, middle school teachers, elementary school teachers. And because of this, shockingly, not a lot of education was going on. And so literacy rates, which had been growing, fall precipitously, leading to some to call the Red Guards the lost generation. Factory managers, because they managed a factory, they're in authority, they are purged. Intellectuals, anyone with a college education, sometimes just anyone with glasses. The former and family of landlords and the middle class. So if you had been a middle class person before the Communist Revolution, like in the 1940s, they come after you. It's like 20 years later, 15 years later, they're like, yep, we're coming back for you. If family of landlords, like, your dad was a landlord. Yeah, but you took all his land, like, and you gave it to the peasants, and that's fine. Like, thumbs up for that, but I'm not a landlord. Yeah, but your family are, and we have to beat you up and shove glass into your fingernails because of it. Like, okay. And effectively, they shut down schools and colleges. So you have this, nearly half a decade period where there is essentially no education going on at all in China. No education in just basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. No education in middle school, high school. No education of engineers, mathematicians, future teachers, architects, scientists. Just nothing. Nothing positive going on in China. The Red Guards eventually got out of control. Shockingly, if you arm teenagers and kids and tell them to reject any and all authority, weird how that could kind of not work out for society. They began to fight each other. They set up their own cliques, and they had different interpretations of the little red book. Like, well, I think this quote means this. Well, clearly you're a capitalist because this quote can only mean this. Or they fought over resources, or anytime someone got in charge, like even within the Red Guard, people like, well, you're an authority figure and we have to reject all authority. We have to, now we're going after you. And so in addition to the schools, the economy of China effectively shuts down completely. And this becomes so chaotic, especially in the cities. The kids in the countryside, especially the real hardcore countryside, they're still farming. Like, some of them get shipped or bused or trained into the cities to join these big Red Guard rallies, and you can see these massive rallies of the Red Guard. But generally, a lot of these are suburban and urban kids because there's more of them around. And so Mao orders the military in. He's like, yeah, the kids are a little out of control. And the Red Guards the Red Guards are shut down by the military. The People's Liberation Army, which is the name of the Chinese military, they killed thousands of kids. They rounded them up. And Mao's like, all right, well, I got all these angry kids, and they're rejecting everything. I got to be careful how I word this, or they might reject me, even though they were pretty obsessed with Mao, these kids. So what do we do with them? Well, Mao comes up with this great thing called Down to the Countryside. He's like, all right, kids, I told you you had experienced revolution, and you did, and things went splendidly, just as I planned. But you also now have to learn what it means to be a worker. You have to be a member of the proletariat. You must join in the struggles of the peasantry to understand the struggles of the peasantry. And so this is the Down to the Countryside campaign, which takes place for a decade. And what they did is they rounded up these Red Guards and they sent 17 million of them to the country. This is a forced migration. They were not allowed to come back. And they had to work alongside the peasants in the fields. And again, these are city kids. These are not kids used to working in the fields. They were relatively unskilled. The peasants who took on these helpers, they weren't happy. Like they just looked at these people, these soft kids, as weak, as another mouth to feed when there's already a famine going on. So they gave them like the worst living conditions, or they just didn't have rooms for them. Like, no, I've got 3 kids and I've got 2 bedrooms. 3 kids live in one. My wife and I live in the other. You guys sleep in the kitchen. Like that's all I've got. I don't have the time to build more bedrooms. And so that led to many, many deaths. And there was also widespread accounts of just brutal abuse. Especially female Red Guards would be abused by the families and the peasants they were sent in. But even the males were just like beaten up or treated poorly because the peasants didn't want them. They didn't need them. They didn't want them. They weren't happy to have them. Another tool, another action of the Great Cultural Revolution were struggle sessions. So these fit kind of hand in hand with the purges and the labor camps. And so anyone suspected of being one of these revisionists, one of these capitalists, one of these rightists, whatever the term they used were forced to attend struggle sessions. And these were brutal, brutal, human rights violations. Pretty clearly, I think you can argue. In these struggle sessions, they are publicly abused. They're grabbing their hair, shoving their face and stuff, throwing things at people, forced to stand in what's called the airplane position. You bend over at the waist where your arms are back and your head is up and your legs are on for minutes and sometimes even hours. They are mocked, yelled at, screamed at, cajoled, beaten, and forced over and over and over and over to confess to whatever crimes they're. Yes, I am a capitalist. Yes, my family were landlords and we benefited and we were cruel to the peasants. Yes, my father went to college and he wanted me to go to college too, whatever it was. The Red Guards often led these struggle sessions, which are part of kind of the purges here. Um, and they also forced other people to join them. The Red Guards are watching, and if you're not throwing things at these people, if you're not screaming in their face, maybe you should go through a struggle session. Maybe you aren't inspired enough by revolutionary fervor. So, it's abuse tied into abuse, tied into abuse. And it led to many, many deaths. Certainly, suicide spiked throughout China during this time period. It's hard to follow all the statistics because there's so much chaos and anarchy going on during the Cultural Revolution that like not a lot of great stuff got recorded, or not a lot of things were recorded, but we have bits and pieces. So in 1 month alone, there were 704 suicides in Shanghai and 534 additional deaths from their normal crime rate. That's just in one city in 1 month. It is estimated by historians that between 500,000 to as many as 1.5 million people were killed. And even if you survived these, that didn't mean you were going to be fine. You would still be sent to re-education camps, which were, of course, labor camps. And you've got this quote here that kind of represents the Red Guard and the idea of these people. This is a Red Guard slogan that they would use. And this is from Xi Fuzi, who's the national police chief. It's no big deal if Red Guards were beating bad people to death. Those who are against Chairman Mao will have their dog skulls smashed into pieces. And so this is how people felt. That's how these Red Guards felt, is all of these people are the enemy. They weren't the enemy. They were just people. And again, it wasn't just one of these. You could be called into 20, 30, 40 of these. The Red Guards could decide to wake you up in the middle of the night, rip you out of your house in your pajamas, and start one of these. And if you resisted, they just killed you. Also, as part of the Great Cultural Revolution, you're like, if there's more, yes, unfortunately, there is more, was the Destroy the Four Olds campaign. The Red Guards were told that what is keeping China back from bringing this glorious, ever revolting society was the old ideas of ancient China. So they had to destroy all parts of historical China: old customs, old culture, old habits, old ideas. And so they just unleashed the Red Guards into temples and into cultural sites. Again, yeah, temples, tombs, statues, libraries, works of art, pottery, monasteries, anything that was a non communist culture had to be smashed. And you can see kind of all this stuff. They're smashing Christian stuff, Buddhist stuff, records, whatever the case may be, blowing stuff up with grenades and artillery, burning statues of Buddha that are hundreds and hundreds of years old. Um, and it's kind of an interesting thing. One criticism of like modern day Western museums in England and France and in America, is that like a lot of the art in them is quote unquote stolen. Like, oh, well, you only have this pottery and stuff because you stole it from China. And it's pretty interesting because, yeah, that actually might be true for some of those works of art. But if the West hadn't taken those things, they probably would have been destroyed. So it's kind of an interesting element. And there was a lot they couldn't save. I mean, again, 5,000 cultural sites, not things destroyed, entire temples wiped out. This also led to the targeting of minorities. In the Central Asia part of the People's Republic of China, Muslims were targeted because they had a different religion. And so they were killed, they were maimed, they were sent to re education camps, their mosques were torn down brick by brick, their Qurans burned because these were the old way. So a persecution of religion. Tibet, another territory taken over by China in 1951, you had a massive persecution of them because Buddhism was an old as well, as one of the four olds that must be destroyed. And you had over 500,000 monks and nuns disappear, just gone. We know they existed, we have birth records, and then all of a sudden they disappear in this 5 year period of this chaos and anarchy. Monasteries are destroyed, relics are destroyed, ancient copies of writings that can never be reproduced are gone forever. So, what are the effects of the Great Cultural Revolution? Well, the economy of China slowed and stopped. It is an utter chaos. There's nothing being produced. There'll be more famines because of it. China gets isolated from the outside world. If Destroy the Four Old is part of this campaign, they're certainly not going to like welcome foreigners. And countries just like, this is crazy. I mean, just like you saw people react to some of Stalin's purges, they're like, yeah, this is what happens when communism goes down. Like, it's not good. Mass human rights violations, people persecuted, the struggle sessions, arrested, jailed, labor camps, executed, forced migrations of the Red Guards into the countryside, culture and history destroyed. The lost generation, all this whole generation of Red Guards for 10 years, there's no education happening. The schools, everything's shut down, which means you have an entire generation that lacks skills and literacy, and a general an aura of fear and unrest and horror in China. And I love this quote: the great proletarian cultural revolution was neither a revolution, nor great, nor cultural, and in particular, not in the least, proletarian. It was driven from the top. It was driven by Mao Zedong, fueled and funneled by urban Red Guards, who many of them were actually part of, like, if you want to call it a middle class, that they would be what was the middle class. And it didn't lead to anything, just destruction of relics and horrors for humanity. In their own words, we've got here between 1966 and 1976, a whole generation of teenagers failed to receive real education. Other Chinese came to call them the last generation. At least 20,000 people lost their lives. It's way more than that. Because of the Cultural Revolution, many Chinese people grew up with no knowledge of traditional Chinese customs and beliefs. Needing to fill that gap, some of them began looking to the West. especially to the Western ideals of democracy, freedom, capitalism, and individualism. And that again is it's it's got a particular point of view. We'll see the effects of it. How does the Cultural Revolution end? Right, the Great Leap Forward ended when there was a famine and millions of people died. Well, actually, the Great Cultural Revolution might have kept going and going and going. It only stops when Mao Zedong dies. I mean, yeah, the Red Guards had been kind of tamed, but the struggle sessions, the labor camps, all the other horrors are still going on. And initially, after Mao dies, and they have this massive public funeral, and people are crying, oh my God, what are we going to do without the great leader? A group called the Gang of Four, led by Mao's wife, Jiang Cheng, tried to take control, and their goal was to continue the Great Leap Forward. There's his wife there. They're like, let's keep this going. Mao's wife liked the Great Cultural Revolution because she hated like old plays and culture. She was like a playwright and artiste, if you will, and she wanted to promote communist art, communist ballet, communist theater. And so what happens is other elements in the Communist Party are like, no, 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 no. We cannot keep this cultural revolution going. And they arrest the Gang of Four, they put them on trial, and essentially they blame them for the cultural revolution. Um, they don't really blame Mao. They don't do the whole like anti-Stalinization thing. They're like, all right, Mao's still pretty popular. The Red Guards are, we kind of squash them, but they're still people. They're still around. Like, we don't want to fight. We don't want to have the people rise up against Mao because we've used propaganda for like, decades to say Mao is awesome. So let's just blame all of the Cultural Revolution on these four people, send them to prison for life, and we're done. It's great. And what you have is a brief period where like no one knows exactly who's in charge, just like when Lenin died, just like when Stalin died, just like you have in these communist dictatorships. And by 1980, a new figure emerges. Well, it's not really new, actually. A figure reemerges. Deng Xiaoping. Now, he had been purged several times, actually, and sent to these labor camps, these re-education camps, because he was one of these intellectuals who believed in, science and math and modernization. But he gains control over the People's Republic of China, and he wants to rebuild China with new ideas and practices. And that's where we'll pick up in the next set of notes. Thanks for joining me.